Dr. Mark Changizi here with your Science Moment. Today I'm going to talk about one of the reasons why I and a lot of us are wanting to not let the COVID authoritarianism, the interventions, lockdowns, masks drop. We don't want to drop it. And there's another reason that it occurred to me that is motivating me, and it's sort of been in my mind, but I'm not sure if quite crystallized. It's not merely identifying the factors that led to it, which is of course a big part of what I'm interested in, understanding emergent phenomena, these kinds of mass collective hysteria, because these are the kinds of things that will always be with us and are our greatest dangers. But another reason why is, I've spent my life, my generation is often, from the 80s arguing against socialism and communism, and that was the typical left-right argument, which is really, was concerning centralized government versus sort of decentralized free markets, and that often was sort of and it's similar it's similar again in terms of COVID. And really, one reason why I don't want it to drop, or that is another reason why I don't want the COVID interventions to be dropped, is because they're a brilliant example of how centralization failed us. Here we had people, their whole lives, they've been pushing for socialism, for centralized control. They always claim to be better than us in knowing how to spend your money. They have an attitude that, like, we're smart, we're educated, we can do better, and it's not fair, and you're selfish and greedy to believe in the free market and capital K, capitalism, or whatever they want to say about it, right? That's the attitude that they've had. So there are two kinds of authoritarianism that occurred during COVID. One was rapid mass hysteria induced, we have to do something, righteous measures, which were utterly irrational. And one could say, if you were imagining you were one of these centralized people, say, I recognize that went out of control. That was not wise, utilitarian, centralized planning at all. But many of those plans, many of those policies were in fact guided ahead of time, like Event 201. And hundreds of these sorts of things, these kinds of public policy institutes are constantly meeting and organizing, figuring out what should we do, which civil liberties violating measures should we do were there to be this that would happen. If this would have happened, then what kinds of measures could we do? And civil liberties is nowhere in their mind at all. It appears to be nowhere. So if you watch Event 201, you have a bunch of well-meaning folks, and they really are well-meaning. They're figuring out how can we, as paternal figures, so to speak, controlling the populace, do a good job, and what kinds of misinformation should we censor and disinformation, we have to control the message, and on and on. That's the kinds of plans when they were slowly deliberating, not in any kind of collective hysteria due to a new righteous cult. That was the baseline. The baseline for experts is that centralized control is the best way to make things happen, right? And civil liberties is very low on that list, and it's not really treated as a constraint at all. One of the reasons we will not let this drop is that when they had full reign, the populace was demanding that they do it, right? They could do anything they want. There was nobody stopping them. And when given the power to do all the centralized things that they could do, they could never have dreamed of doing. Neil Ferguson said, the stuff that China's doing is off the table. And he's like, well, I guess it's not off the table, right? He couldn't believe, the experts couldn't believe that the population was begging for Communist China level interventions. They were begging for it. And when they got their way and could do it, they bungled everything. They implemented lockdowns, which in even Event 201 recommended in point 3 not to do. Right? But all the other recommendations, the authoritarian recommendations, they did, and much, much more. Right? It is a blaring example that should be remembered for a century, how when centralized do-gooders got their way, they failed to slow transmission, they only turned people against one another, they only caused massive economic and excess deaths harm through their well-intentioned, centralized means to implement their ingenious scheme to save us all. That's why we're not going to let it drop. It is evidence number one in terms of recency of the failure of centralized control. And that was your science moment. If you haven't gotten a copy of our much censored book, Expressly Human, which is about the foundations of free expression itself and why we evolved emotional expressions in the first place, get a copy today.